in the USA June 2022. A task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Report. Content warning. Report contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. The report contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence.
Devices used to suppress black political participation. Americans strove to build and maintain the promise of black citizenship after emancipation. The end of Reconstruction left them unprotected against the white supremacists who had previously enslaved them. Reconstruction, white Americans in both the North and South employed a host of devices to reassert white supremacy and suppress black political power. As a result, African Americans, who had already been voting for many years, were barred from voting. To suppress black political power. After 3 racial terror details, white Americans resorted to kidnapping, mass murder, and other forms of racial terror to reassert white supremacy and destroy black political power all across the southern states. 129 The federal and Republican-run state governments tried to suppress this violence, but white local officials and law enforcement across the South often turned a blind eye or even participated in the violence themselves. 130 federal and state officials themselves have used their power to target and terrorize civil rights leaders. 131. During Reconstruction, about 10% of black political officials reported receiving violent threats and suffered physical assaults. In 32, at least 35 black officials were murdered by the Ku Klux Klan or similar terrorist organizations. 133, though the federal government intervened to stop early violence in Louisiana, Americans in both the North and South began to protest federal military intervention in local affairs. 134 According to one historian, the spectacle of soldiers into the hall and expelling members at the ANA aroused more northern opposition than any previous federal action in the South. 135 Grant's cabinet urged the president to wash the hands of the administration entirely of the whole business, referring to the repeated white insurrections in Louisiana. Political backlash made congressional Republicans wary of further military intervention in the South. In 36, when the Republican governor of Mississippi, a member of Grant's own party, requested federal aid against white supremacist insurrection, President Grant wrote, "The whole public are tired out with these annual autumnal outbreaks in the South. Are ready now to condemn any interference on the part of the government." 137 of American history, then, the federal government sacrificed the lives and rights of African Americans for political stability, while white Americans in the South wrought racial violence to oppress African Americans. Any threats to their lives, black activists organized in response to these campaigns of racial terror. Organizations like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, a group of black intellectuals and activists who partnered with white liberals to pursue black civil rights and equality, legal challenges against many of the devices described throughout this chapter. 138 state governments sought to sabotage these efforts. For instance, created the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission, an agency created to resist the civil rights movement and preserve racial segregation. 39 The commission planted clerical workers in the offices of civil rights attorneys, spied on civil rights organizations, obstructed black voter registration, and encouraged police harassment of African Americans. 140 Federal government, at times, targeted and terrorized civil rights leaders as well. In the 1950s and 1960s, for instance, when Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. urged nonviolent protest to pursue racial justice, Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, Director J. Edgar Hoover. Dr. King is a communist threat and ordered the electronic surveillance of Dr. King and his staff. Though the FBI's surveillance uncovered no evidence of communist influence, it uncovered evidence of Dr. King's extramarital affairs, and used this information not only to try and discredit Dr. King as a leader of the civil rights, but also to attempt to convince Dr. King to take his own life. 143 They are out to break me, Dr. King confided to a friend. They are out to get me, harass me, break my spirit. 144 Government continued to surveil and sabotage other black activists and organizations. 1960s and 1970s, the federal government took extensive measures to surveil the Black Panther Party, using undercover agents to infiltrate the group and sow discord, contributing to its collapse. 145. The public exposure of the FBI's surveillance activities forced the government to enact several reforms. Those reforms weakened over time, and the FBI has reportedly resumed similar programs surveilling black activists, including those in the Black Lives Matter movement. 146. Codes and vagrancy laws. Discussed later in Chapter 11, an unjust legal system. It's passed a series of laws between 1865 and 1866, which historians refer to collectively as the Black Codes, to criminalize freed African Americans for engaging in ordinary activity and force them back into forms of enslaved labor. 147. During Reconstruction, Republicans in Congress managed to remove these Black Codes with the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment. 48. But after the end of Reconstruction, former Confederate states began passing a flurry of laws similar to the post-Civil War Black Codes that, while racially neutral on their face, added up to slavery-like conditions in practice. 149. Every former Confederate state except Tennessee enacted vagrancy laws between 1890 and 1909, which criminalized idle behavior and forced African Americans back into conditions of enslavement. 150. Limiting the formation of black businesses and spaces that provided the foundation for black community and political consciousness. 51. By criminalizing African Americans for everyday conduct, these laws suppress black political participation in two ways. African Americans convicted of a crime could not vote or serve on juries. Americans were prevented from organizing to protest these laws, because these laws made such gatherings illegal. 152. Detests. The 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution declared that a person's right to vote shall not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. 153 states created many laws designed to block black voting without referring to race. 154. One of these methods was the literacy test. Voting registrars or poll workers would test a person's reading or writing capabilities before permitting them to register or vote. These tests required a prospective voter to either write down a certain piece of text, such as a part of the Constitution, or to write down answers to written questions. 155. Following Reconstruction, at least 21 states in both the North and South used literacy tests to deny African Americans their voting rights. 156. Described in Chapter 6 on separate and unequal education, states and local governments deprived African Americans of educational resources and opportunities during enslavement and after emancipation. 57. Consequently, states adopted literacy tests knowing that such barriers would primarily exclude black voters. 58. At the South Carolina Constitutional Convention of 1895, Senator Ben Tillman explained that the literacy test was intended to take the vote away from ignorant, blacks. 59. When Mississippi adopted literacy tests, among other voting restrictions, in its 1890 Constitutional Convention, the president of the convention declared, "Let us tell the truth if it bursts the bottom of the universe. We came here to exclude the Negro." 160. Even when many African Americans were well equipped to pass ordinary literacy tests, states excluded black voters by requiring them to satisfy more complex requirements than those required for white voters. 161. Asking subjective questions that gave white officials the discretion to exclude black voters. 162. Or requiring black voters to answer impossible questions, such as how many bubbles are in a bar of soap. 163. One Georgian official boasted the President of the United States from registering to vote, if I want to. God couldn't understand that sentence in the literacy test. I, myself, am the judge. 164. Mississippi adopted literacy tests, among other voting restrictions. In its 1890 Constitutional Convention, the president of the convention declared, "Let us tell the truth if it bursts the bottom of the universe. We came here to exclude the Negro." African Americans challenged these literacy tests in court, but met with little success. In 1898, the United States Supreme Court upheld Mississippi's literacy test in a case called Williams v. Mississippi. 165. After an all-white jury convicted Henry Williams, a black man, of murder, Williams appealed, arguing that he did not receive a fair trial because blacks were excluded from the jury. 166. Jury list was drawn from the state's voter registries. The court examined whether Mississippi's literacy test had illegally blocked African Americans from registering to vote. 7. The court approved of the literacy tests, holding that the literacy test did not mention race and therefore did not discriminate based on race. 6G. The strategy pursued by Mississippi and other states worked. States could pass racist laws designed to deny black votes, and so long as the laws did not mention race, those laws would be upheld in court. The Supreme Court's approval, states continued to use literacy tests to restrict black voting through the 20th century. 169. It took 100 years after the end of Reconstruction for the federal government to permanently ban literacy tests nationwide through an amendment to the Voting Rights Act in 1975. 170. Despite this federal prohibition, some states, like North Carolina, still have unenforceable literacy tests on the books today. 171. While states enacted literacy tests after Reconstruction in the late 1800s, these voting restrictions lasted well until the late 20th century, shaping the lives of Americans who currently live and serve in public office. Joseph Biden, and at least 80 out of the 100 current U.S. senators, were alive when literacy tests were still legal in the United States. 172. Requirements and poll taxes. States also used property requirements and poll taxes to prevent African Americans from voting. 173. Beginning in early American colonial history, states required individuals to own a certain amount of land or property before they could vote. 74. After American independence, more states removed or relaxed these laws, and many new states never adopted them at all. 175. But to prevent free black men from voting, many states began limiting only to white men. 176. The 15th Amendment forced states to eliminate this express racial discrimination, but with the end of Reconstruction, states in both the North and South reenacted these property restrictions or created new ones. Poll taxes to require potential voters to make a payment before they could cast their ballot. 177. These laws had the effect of excluding all poor voters, white and black alike. The law specifically exploited the fact that African Americans, newly freed from slavery, often began their free lives without any wealth, preventing them from affording the costs of the poll tax. Additionally, some states, such as Alabama, required a person to pay poll taxes for prior elections in which they had not voted, a penalty that directly targeted African Americans, who could not have voted until after emancipation. 178. Heated challenges from civil rights activists. Poll taxes remained a persistent barrier to the right to vote until 1965. In 1979 and 1937, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the use of state poll taxes, declaring that poll taxes did not deny any constitutional right because the privilege of voting is conferred by the state and the state may condition suffrage as it deems appropriate. 180. The effects poll taxes had on voting. Congress attempted to ban poll taxes in some fashion in 1942, 1943, 1945, and 1947. 181. None of those laws passed the Senate due to Southern senators' use of the filibuster, a Senate rule requiring a two-thirds majority before debate could end and a vote could be taken on a bill. 82. The Southern senators' reasoning behind their defense of the poll tax was simple. The poll tax was one of the devices used to suppress black voters and keep the senators in power. Poll tax affected whites more than blacks. The Southern senators believed that repeal of the poll tax would provide momentum to removing other barriers blocking black voting in the South. 183. It took decades more of activism and litigation before Congress prohibited poll taxes in 1965. 184. And the Supreme Court ruled poll taxes to be unconstitutional in 1966. 185. Laws and witness requirements to exclude black voters. States also used challenger laws and laws requiring witnesses to attest to voters. 186. Challenger laws allow private citizens to contest another person's qualifications to vote, usually by making a complaint before the local or state officials charged with registering voters or administering the polls during Election Day. 187. Many states enacted such laws before the Civil War, some as far back as the American Revolution. 188. Following Reconstruction, however, states in both the North and South used these laws to allow white supremacists to challenge, intimidate, and suppress black votes. 189. Virginia enacted its first challenger law in 1870, a few months after the end of Reconstruction. 190. The state reenacted the law in 1904, following its 1901 to 1902 Constitutional Convention. 191. Which the state held mainly for the purpose of disenfranchising the Negro voter. 192. The lawmakers enacted laws in 1877 requiring voters challenged at the polls to produce two witnesses personally known to at least two polling officials. 93, because Florida's polling officials were almost exclusively white, few black citizens could provide witnesses known to them, meaning that Florida's challenger law allowed any white citizen to block a black voter from casting their ballot. 94. Though many of these challenger and witness laws have been modified through time, they remain prevalent today. As of 2012, 46 states have laws that permit private citizens to challenge other citizens' voting eligibility. 195. Other clauses. States understood that the onerous voting requirements they imposed, if applied fairly, could exclude white voters. 2. That these restrictions primarily excluded black voters. A half-dozen states in the South created so-called grandfather clauses. 96 grandfather clauses allowed voters to vote, even if they could not pay the poll tax or otherwise would not have passed a literacy test, as long as they had been entitled to vote prior to 1866 or 1867. Descended from someone who had been entitled to vote prior to 1866 or 1867. 197. In fact, this meant that African Americans, who had not been eligible to vote prior to 1866 or 1867 in most of these states, would be the ones subject to the new voting restrictions. The Supreme Court ruled these grandfather clauses to be discriminatory and unconstitutional in 1915. 198. While grandfather clauses had a relatively shorter lifespan than literacy tests or poll taxes, they presented one of many tools used in combination with others to prevent African Americans from exercising their right to vote. States enacted many of their supposedly race-neutral laws with the purposeful design of disenfranchising black voters. From state primary elections, white Americans also prevented black voters from participating in state party primary elections. 199. Since the late 1890s, political parties in the United States have held primary elections to allow voters to determine the candidates from their party who would run for office. 1910, state legislatures and state Democratic Party chapters in the South created the white primary, excluding all black voters from the state primary election process. 201. Dominated by a single political party, determining who would run from that party essentially determined who would ultimately hold office. Democrats dominated state elections in the South in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The exclusion of black voters from Democrat state primaries in the South during this period essentially excluded African Americans from having any say in their elected representatives. 202. NAACP brought legal challenges against the white primary and won a case in 1927 when the U.S. Supreme Court held it unconstitutional under the 14th. For a state government to pass laws excluding black citizens from a state primary election. 3. However, because the 14th Amendment applied only to state actions, Southern Democratic Party leaders skirted around the Supreme Court's decision by excluding black voters through the rules of its political party, which was considered a private organization. 204. Enacted its first challenger law in 1870, a few months after the end of Reconstruction. State reenacted the law in 1904, following its 1901 to 1902 Constitutional Convention, which the state held mainly for the purpose of disenfranchising the Negro voter. 1944, the Supreme Court closed the loophole and ruled that states could not allow private political parties to exclude blacks from voting in state primaries. In 5. Following the end of the all-white primary, a record 35,000 African Americans voted in the 1948 Democratic primary in South Carolina. 206 states throughout the country have long disqualified people convicted of felonies from voting. America's discriminatory criminal justice system, described in Chapter 11, an unjust legal system, states throughout America have used these laws to prevent African Americans from voting and continue to do so today. 207. Denying people convicted of felonies their right to vote have existed since at least the colonial period of American history, finding roots in earlier English, European, and Roman law. 208. Although early U.S. institutions gave their legislatures the power to pass laws disenfranchising people who had committed crimes, many states, including Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, only passed such laws after the Civil War to deny African Americans their newly gained right to vote. 9. Construction, state governments sought to maintain white supremacy by using vagrancy laws, curfews, and other restrictions to target African Americans with criminal laws as a form of social control. 10. Because states targeted African Americans for prosecution, and because convicted African Americans were stripped of ability to vote, states effectively used criminal laws to not only control African Americans, but also to deprive them of their right to vote. War, in many southern states, the percentage of non-white people imprisoned nearly doubled between 1850 and 1870. 211 in Alabama, for example, 2. If the prison population was non-white in 1850, but by 1870, 74% of the prison population was non-white, even though the total non-white population increased by only 3%. 12. Ever since the Civil War era, states have imprisoned African Americans at higher rates than white Americans. 213. One study examining historical data found that when more of the people imprisoned by a state are black, the state is significantly more likely to enact laws removing their right to vote if they have been convicted of a felony. 214. States made clear that they targeted African Americans with their laws removing the right to vote from people convicted of felonies. According to the North Carolina Democratic Party's Executive Committee Handbook in 1898, North Carolina's restriction originates from the state's efforts to rescue the white people of the East from the curse of Negro domination. 15. The Mississippi Constitutional Convention in 1890 changed its disenfranchising provision from one that included any crime to one affecting only certain offenses like burglary or theft. The Mississippi Supreme Court explained as one made to obstruct black voting by targeting certain crimes the state believed that black residents committed more frequently. 216. States expressly tied disenfranchisement to furtive offenses, peculiar to the Negro's low economic and social status. 17. Some scholars suggest that because denying the vote for those convicted of crimes was narrower in scope than literacy tests or poll taxes, and easier to justify than grandfather clauses, used criminal disenfranchisement laws as insurance if courts decided to strike down other, more blatantly discriminatory laws. 218. Most of these disenfranchisement laws continue to exist across the country in some form to this day, though the Supreme Court has recognized that citizenship is not a right that expires upon misbehavior. 219. The Supreme Court has not extended that same logic to the right to vote. 220. Targeted African Americans for prosecution, and because convicted African Americans were stripped of their ability to vote, states effectively used criminal laws to not only control African Americans, but also to deprive them of their right to vote. 1974, the Supreme Court upheld California's law disenfranchising people convicted of felonies, concluding that the removal of their voting rights is consistent with the 14th Amendment. Though the Supreme Court eventually struck down a part of Alabama's disenfranchisement law a decade later, it only struck down a specific provision, applying to crimes of moral turpitude, that it found had the specific intent and impact of preventing black citizens from voting. 122. In that limited decision, the court expressly declined to reconsider its decision in Richardson v. Ramirez, which continues to generally permit the disenfranchisement of people convicted of felonies. 223. People convicted of felonies, a disproportionate number of whom are black, represent the largest single group of Americans disqualified from voting. 24. For example, although the majority of illegal drug users and dealers nationwide are white, 3/4 of all people imprisoned for drug offenses are black or Latino. In 25, another study found that states with greater black and Latino prison populations are more likely to ban formerly incarcerated and returning citizens from voting than states with proportionally fewer non-whites in the criminal justice system. 226. 2020, approximately 5.2 million Americans are barred from voting due to laws that disenfranchise citizens convicted of felony offenses. In 27, all states, but Maine and Vermont, have some restriction tied to felony conviction, probation, and parole. 228. And while some states restore the right to vote once people have completed their sentence, these states condition that restoration of rights upon a person paying all fines and fees associated with their sentence. Economic burden that scholars and voting rights advocates have described as a modern-day poll tax. 29. In a country that professes a commitment to freedom, the country's rates of mass incarceration and the corresponding increase in disenfranchisement reflect a conflict between its democratic ideals and its actual practice. Gerrymandering. It's also manipulated the shape of voting districts through a process called gerrymandering to dilute the voting power of African Americans. 30. Generally, states divide their regions into districts for the election of certain local, state, and federal representatives. 231 states can redraw those areas from year to year, 232 in government. Officials have used this process to substantially dilute and weaken the political power of African Americans. 233. Ordinarily, states draw electoral districts by drawing generally oval or square-shaped districts of neighboring communities with borders based on geographic barriers, like rivers and highways. 134, however, politicians began manipulating this process by drawing electoral districts in more unnatural shapes to include more voters from a certain race or political party to ensure that group's victory in an election. 235. Process, known as gerrymandering, is named after Elbridge Gerry, an American vice president who, as Massachusetts governor in 1812, read voting districts in a way that caused the Boston area district to resemble a salamander. 136, or, as one local newspaper dubbed it, a gerrymander. 237. Gerrymandering has existed since this nation's infancy, and politicians have used it nearly as long to deny black communities representation in government. After the end of Reconstruction, white government officials drew gerrymandered districts to purge black politicians from state legislatures all across the South. 238. Although African Americans made up a majority of South Carolina's population in the 1870s and 1880s, white government officials redrew the state's electoral map to pack nearly all of the state's black neighborhoods into one of the state's 7 districts that had majority, and it included nearly all of the state's black neighborhoods in the awkward shape of a snake. 239. Drawing the map this way had the effect of ensuring that only one of the state's 7 legislators were black, despite African Americans making up more than 60% of the state's total population. Government officials drew similarly gerrymandered congressional districts across the South, including in North Carolina, Alabama, and Mississippi. 240. The Mississippi government drew the black electoral district in the shape of which one newspaper called a shoestring. 241. Gerrymandering continued in the 20th century. After World War II, a thriving black community began organizing politically in Tuskegee, Alabama. 42, but white segregationists responded by proposing a bill to redraw the boundary lines of Tuskegee to exclude all neighborhoods with black residents and exclude black voters from having any input into the city's elections. 43. Black residents fought back, bringing a case that reached the Supreme Court in 1960, where the court struck down the racially gerrymandered map as a violation of the 15th Amendment. 244. A few years later, Congress enacted the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Prohibits states from diluting the voting strength of African Americans, including through redistricting plans that dilute the voting strength of black communities. 245. By prohibitions by both Congress and the Supreme Court, states continued to try and find ways to gerrymander state maps to limit black representation. In the 1980s, Georgia State Representative Joe McWilson. I don't want to draw nigger districts. 246. A little more than a decade later, the Supreme Court would strike down North Carolina's efforts to gerrymander on the basis of race, stating it was unsettling how closely the North Carolina plan resembles the most egregious racial gerrymanders of the past. 147. Meanwhile, states continue to engage in 2 other forms of legally sanctioned racial gerrymandering: partisan gerrymandering and prison gerrymandering. Or partisan gerrymandering refers to the process of drawing districts to benefit one political party over another. 248. As of September 2021, 38 states allow partisan actors, state legislatures or their appointees, to redraw their districts. 149. While those who engage in partisan gerrymandering claim not to directly target black voters, the fact that most black voters register to vote as Democrats today means that partisan gerrymandering often affects black representation as well. African Americans had historically supported the Republican Party through post-Reconstruction due to the party's role in emancipation and Reconstruction. Republican Party's apathy and mistreatment toward African Americans during the Hoover administration opened the door to their entry into the Democratic Party during the New Deal. Democrats like President Franklin Roosevelt promised economic aid amidst the Great Depression. 250. Support for the Democratic Party then surged in the 1960s, when Democratic President Lyndon B. Johnson ushered in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. 151. President Johnson's embrace of civil rights legislation caused many of the Southern white supremacists from the Democratic Party to defect to the Republican Party, cementing black support for Democrats to this day. 52. From 1994 to 2019, over 80% of black registered voters have leaned toward or identified as Democrats. 253. Most black voters today register to vote as Democrats. Partisan gerrymandering harms black representation. Last decade, more than 24 black officials have had their districts redrawn in ways that could cost them their seats, leading the former chair of the Congressional Black Caucus to declare partisan gerrymandering a 5-alarm fire for black representation. 254. Unlike earlier forms of racial gerrymandering, neither Congress nor the U.S. Supreme Court have prohibited partisan gerrymandering. 55 as scholars and advocates have observed, the Supreme Court's refusal to strike down political gerrymandering permits legislators to get away with racial gerrymandering in places where race and party are highly correlated, by claiming that they made the redistricting decisions for partisan reasons, rather than racial ones. 256. And gerrymandering refers to the practice of counting incarcerated people as part of the population in the region and imprisoning them, rather than the location of their actual community. 257, because the government allocates greater numbers of political representatives resources to places with greater populations, prison gerrymandering benefits districts that engage in mass incarceration, skewing resources and representation to areas with prisons at the expense of the communities to which those imprisoned people belong. 258. Gerrymandering has existed since this nation's infancy, and politicians have used it nearly as long to deny black communities representation in government. This particularly affects African Americans, who are disproportionately imprisoned. In 2019, African Americans made up about 33% of the United States' imprisoned population, 259 despite representing about 14% of the total population. 260 given the effects of prison gerrymandering, advocates describe it as akin to the Constitution's 3/5 clause, which counted enslaved people in the census for the purpose of allowing states to amass more pro-slavery representatives, despite the fact that enslaved people were not allowed to vote and had no basic legal rights. 261. Voter fraud and voter ID laws. Claims of voter fraud have also been used to justify laws that suppress black voting, most prominently, voter identification (ID) laws. Voter fraud has long been invoked throughout American history to justify restrictions on voting. Such claims have made a recent resurgence, including in the 2020 election, despite the lack of any evidence to support allegations of widespread fraud. 162 In recent years, states have used this claim to enact a number of strict ID laws that disproportionately impact black and other non-white voters, hindering their ability to vote. 263. Politicians have invoked the specter of voter fraud since at least the late 1800s to justify the various rules they imposed disenfranchising black and other non-white communities. 264 The Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacists claimed voter fraud to justify the violence they inflicted upon African Americans. One Southern historian claimed in 1901 that the white man of the lately dominant class in the South, former slaves repeating at elections, and quoted with favor a white supremacist leader and his announcement that he and his militants had violently suppressed black voters such that few Negroes voted that day, none twice. 165 Thus, white supremacists have long used accusations of voter fraud as an excuse to justify the suppression of black political participation. 266. The idea of voter fraud and voter identification laws became popular following the 2000 election. 267 The U.S. Attorney General at the time, John Ashcroft, pushed the U.S. Department of Justice to prioritize voter fraud as an issue. 268 Even though the U.S. Department of Justice itself found only a 0.0000132% rate of voter fraud. 269. Congress enacted the Help America Vote Act in 2002, which required voter identification to register to vote and deferred to states' requirements for voter identification. In 70 many civil rights organizations opposed the bill for its discriminatory impact, arguing that the requirement would mirror a poll tax. 71 In 2005, Georgia and Indiana became the first states to enact photo identification voting laws, opening the floodgates for similar laws throughout the country. 72 In 2000, only 11 states required all voters to show some form of identification. This increased to 18 states in 2008, 273 and, as of 2021, 35 states have laws requesting or requiring voters to show identification at the polls. 274. Identification laws may appear race-neutral, they disproportionately burden black voters due to disparities in both access and enforcement. In one nationwide study, 20% of African Americans did not possess a valid photo ID, compared to 7% of whites. 75 due to segregation and unequal access, many elderly black voters were not born in hospitals, resulting in many never being issued a birth certificate, and this fact, in turn, limits their ability to obtain other forms of photo identification. 276. States disproportionately enforce voter ID laws against black voters. Studies have found that 70% of all black voters were asked to show photo identification at the polls during the 2008 election, as opposed to only 51% of white voters. 77. These disparities in enforcement forced black voters to file provisional ballots at 4 times the rate of white voters. 278 provisional ballots, in turn, are more likely to go counted. 279 in 2016, nearly 700,000, or 28.5% of all provisional ballots went uncounted. In 2018, nearly 790,000, or 42.6% of all provisional ballots were not counted. 280. Most black voters today register to vote as Democrats. Partisan gerrymandering harms black representation. Last decade, more than 24 black officials have had their districts redrawn in ways that could cost them their seats, leading the former chair of the Congressional Black Caucus to declare partisan gerrymandering a 5-alarm fire for black representation. Citizens with ready access to voter identification might underestimate the burdens that voter ID requirements impose. American Civil Liberties Union has calculated, for those who need to procure a voter ID, the combined cost of time, travel, and documentation ranges from $75 to $175, $281 a steep cost to consider when poll taxes of as little as $1. Been deemed an unconstitutional burden on the right to vote. 282. Even obtaining free identification cards may require a person to not only purchase a birth certificate, 283, but to travel to a DMV, which in some regions could be as far as 250 miles away. 284. In many cases, states intentionally use voter ID laws to discriminate against black voters and people with lower incomes, perpetuating America's legacy of creating barriers to black voting. 85. For example, when crafting North Carolina's voter identification laws, one state representative expressly asked a university official to provide information about the number of student ID cards that are created and the percent of those who are African American. Appeals court characterized these restrictions as targeting black voters with almost surgical precision. 286. Powell points out, it is no coincidence that the states with the most rigid voter identification laws also happen to be states with substantial black populations and a history of post-Reconstruction style discrimination at the polls. 287. Multiple Republican strategists that voter ID laws have nothing to do with voter fraud, and are instead part of a strategy of ensuring that Democrats cannot vote. 88. Because black voters identify overwhelmingly with the Democratic Party, 289 political strategists openly seeking to disenfranchise Democrats will necessarily target black voters. 90. Ultimately, scholars have found that strict voter ID laws substantially decrease voting turnout for black and Latino voters, doubling the voting gap between white and black voters. 291. Exclusion from juries. Debarring African Americans from voting, post-Reconstruction states in both the North and South also excluded African Americans from serving on juries. Sixth Amendment to the United States Constitution guarantees criminal trials by an impartial jury. 292 juries serve the essential role of balancing government power by giving citizens the authority to determine a just outcome in a case of law. 293. 1800s, many states, such as Tennessee and West Virginia, expressly allowed only white men to serve on juries. 84. While many states in the North did not have laws excluding black jurors, one historian observed that, and most of the North, custom and prejudice to exclude Negroes from jury service. 295. During Reconstruction, Congress partially undid these restrictions with the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which prohibited states from expressly discriminating based on race in the selection of juries in state court. 296. The act did not address the many other methods that states used to exclude black jurors. 297. For example, states ordinarily required a jury decision to be unanimous to determine whether someone is guilty or innocent of a crime. 198. But this meant that the presence of a single black juror could prevent a white jury from convicting a black defendant. Around this, states like Louisiana and Oregon passed laws allowing a jury to convict a defendant if only 10 of the 12 jurors voted to convict. 299. U.S. Supreme Court observed in Ramos v. Louisiana 2020, states like Louisiana and Oregon removed jury unanimity requirements after Reconstruction to ensure that African American juror service would be meaningless, since one or two black jurors could not outvote a white majority. Many states, only registered voters can serve on juries, so because these states denied African Americans the ability to register to vote, they denied them access to the jury box as well. Finally, many states excluded black jurors through various state rules that allowed judges, court officials, and local jurors to prevent a person from serving on a jury without giving a reason. 302 is discussed in Chapter 11, An Unjust Legal System. These methods produced deep disparities in the number of African Americans convicted of crimes, including wrongful convictions. 303. California amended its constitution in 1879 to allow non-white men to vote. The state adopted many laws similar to those adopted by northern and southern states to suppress the political participation of African Americans. 104. California added a poll tax into its constitution in 1879, requiring payment of an average half-day's wage before someone could vote. 305. The poll tax continued until repealed in 1914. 106. In 1894, California added a literacy test for voting to its constitution to prevent Chinese residents from voting. 307. Unsurprisingly, anti-Chinese and anti-black racism in California frequently intertwined. California State Democratic Party, for instance, pledged in 1867 to establish no Negro or Chinese suffrage. 308. And its racist pledge enabled Democrats to sweep state elections that year. 309. After World War II, the black population in California rose dramatically. 310. With a growing presence in the state, black communities in California continued pushing for greater political representation. They faced resistance and retaliation along the way. Like the federal government, frequently treated black activism as a threat. 111. In 1966, when civil rights protesters used the slogan of Black Power to advocate for racial equality, the Republican candidate for lieutenant governor, Robert Finch, declared that it's wrong if minority, including the Negro people, think they can blackmail or blackjack their way into acceptance into our society. They're just dead wrong, and the American people will not tolerate this kind of thing. 312. Same year, Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale formed the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California. Black economic empowerment and the end of police brutality. 313. To pursue these goals, the Panthers adopted a number of community service programs, including healthcare clinics, a free breakfast program for school children. 314. And police observation patrols. 315. After Martin Luther King, Jr., the federal government and California viewed the Black Panthers as a 316. Vice President Spiro Agnew labeled the Black Panthers an anarchistic group of criminals. 17. Federal Bureau of Investigation Director Hoover declared that the Black Panther Party, without question, represents the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. 118. Through its counterintelligence program, the FBI surveilled and sabotaged the Black Panthers. 319. The FBI sent anonymous, inflammatory letters to restaurants, grocery stores, and churches to dissuade them from providing food or facilities for the free breakfast program. 320. To suppress the Black Panthers' newsletter activities, the FBI ordered the Internal Revenue Service to audit the organization and any income they received from distributing newsletters. 121. Further, the FBI infiltrated the group with undercover agents and spread misinformation, paranoia, conflict, and distrust within the party. 122. Californian law enforcement also repeatedly arrested Black Panther members on harassment and public disorder charges, disrupting the organization and sapping resources away from its community service initiatives. 323. These efforts contributed to the organization's collapse in 1982. 324. States in the North and South, California also stripped individuals of their right to vote when they were convicted of a felony, embedding such a provision in its constitution since 1849. 25. It took 125 years before California eventually changed this wholesale denial of voting rights in 1974, amending its constitution to allow individuals convicted of felonies to vote if they had completed their sentence and parole. 126. In 2016, the state legislature restored voting rights to people convicted of a felony offense housed in jail, but not in prison. 327. In 2020, approximately 243,000 Californians were barred from voting due to felony convictions. 328 of that number, 50,000, or about 20%, are black. 29 only recently, in 2020, did California voters approve Proposition 17, which amended the state's constitution to restore the right to vote to all individuals who have completed their prison term, even if they are still on parole. 330. Californian law enforcement also repeatedly arrested Black Panther members on harassment and public disorder charges, disrupting the organization and sapping resources away from its community service initiatives. Efforts contributed to the organization's collapse in 1982.